and I'm not making that allegation, but WhatsApp messages, text messages become really difficult to obtain by the police. Now, if the police want to secure that type of evidence, they can simply apply for a Section 8 arrest warrant, search warrant at a magistrate's court, and go and secure property, telephones, computers, filing cabinet files and such like. And that's something that I would very much hope that Scotland Yard gets to the position of doing, because they have powers that we don't have, and those powers are going to be needed in order to bring people to justice.
Thanks.
Just another question for Alice. Given the Secretary of State's response in December, what is sort of the next step for
Well, we are waiting for the court to list a hearing, which we hope will take place in the near future, given the urgency. So we're at the stage of proposing directions for how soon that should take place, and I hope that it will be listed and heard as soon as possible.
Right. Ben, did you have your
Hi. So I think it was 2 weeks ago, Boris Johnson criticised Scotland Yard's war crimes unit and said that we've got record levels of crime in this country, and the budgets for the Metropolitan Police are, woefully inadequate. Is it not? Could there not be better use of police resources in this country than investigating things happening abroad?
So I made comment about this publicly at the time Boris Johnson made these remarks, and what he accused Scotland Yard of doing is politicising a war crime or a war crimes investigation of themselves, in fact. And I think that's really disingenuous. First of all, Boris Johnson's political interference in Scotland Yard is politicisation of Scotland Yard, and it's not welcome. And where Scotland Yard, I'll make it very clear, where Scotland Yard has an active investigation or has an investigation, or there is a potential of an investigation, an attempt to interfere with that is a crime, a domestic crime. It's called perverting the course of justice, or attempts to pervert the course of justice. And so I would make it really clear that where individuals at this stage, now that a complaint has been lodged with Scotland Yard, and there is a potential or a likelihood of an investigation, make it clear that there is, because of the fact that the complaint's been lodged by British victims. Any interference or attempt to interfere with that will be a crime. And ICJP will make sure that those people are held to account for that. In terms of budget and Scotland Yard's budget, I completely agree. I feel very sorry for the police in the United Kingdom, because under Boris Johnson's government, and when he was Prime Minister, and other governments, the police have had their legs taken away from them in terms of their investigative ability. They've been defunded. They've been their funding has been diminished massively. Now, it would have been good if, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he'd have had these thoughts and funded the police properly at that time. And it's also really telling that the Scotland Yard doesn't just investigate the occupied Palestinian territories or Gaza and the war crimes against Israel. It initially launched its investigation with regards to Israel proper. And it's really telling that I didn't hear Boris Johnson criticising that investigation. It was only when the situation on the ground unfolded and Scotland Yard became aware of that, and it properly, under its statutory obligation under the International Criminal Court Act, decided that it had to respond to the ICC's request for evidence and collect evidence in the UK and provide that to the ICC, that they took that step. That's a statutory obligation, something that Boris Johnson should know, although he does tend to make mistakes when it comes to law, I have to say, right? Now, as well as that, it's not just the Ukraine itself. The Ukraine itself has been supported by Scotland Yard collecting evidence in the United Kingdom and passing that to the ICC, and I don't see people criticising that either. It's really important that when the police carry out an investigation, and they carry out that investigation particularly on the basis of British citizens making complaints in the UK, and all the obligations under British statute, that they're allowed to do their job without interference. And I think that kind of is my full answer to Boris Johnson's what I would call interference with Scotland Yard and attempts to politicise this investigation, which I'd say again are unwelcome.
Thanks. I saw Oliver's hand last time round.
Yeah, Oliver Vincent from New Europe. So this is a question for Mike. Given that there's a case going on at the ICJ, if a preliminary verdict comes out from that case, or it's indicated that Israelis complicity in genocide and breaking its obligations. Is that going to change the nature of your investigation, and is that likely to change the nature of Scotland Yard's investigation?
Well, thank you for that question. What I would say is that it shouldn't. This particular complaint doesn't assert the crime of genocide, but covers a wider range of war crimes, which touch on some of those aspects that were covered at the ICJ. What I would say is that the complaint that was submitted is for crimes. Well, there's a different legal principles that are being addressed at the ICJ. So I think what ICJP would be doing is continuing to investigate, continuing to submit evidence to the Metropolitan Police. A ruling from the ICJ wouldn't impact it, but we'd certainly analyze it and take it from there. Tyb, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's right to say, I mean, Heidi's correct. This is a very specific complaint about very specific crimes and very specific individuals. But ICJP, we've been investigating the crime of genocide for a while. We have collated evidence, some of which you can see spoken about in South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice. And you'll see one of the witnesses that has already given evidence to Scotland Yard, Professor Ghassan Abu Sitta, is mentioned in the ICJ, South Africa ICJ complaint with regards to evidence that he's given. So you take the genocide complaint, two aspects of it. You have the actions. In our complaint, you have the actions there very clearly. So if you find these actions, then you find that war crimes have been committed, and half of the test for the genocide complaint would be made out. The other side are the speeches or the intent, showing the intent. And with regards to both, the ICJP is still collating evidence to a criminal standard for the crime of genocide. And if we get to the point where we feel that we have sufficient evidence to bring that complaint, we will provide that evidence to Scotland Yard and to the International Criminal Court for the crime of genocide.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify the reply from the Trade Minister about the issue of the deals with the Israeli weapons and arms deals.
This is for Alice, perhaps. Yeah.
So what was their justification? Have they got assurances from the Israeli government that they are not using the weapons in Gaza?
They have no assurances, no. Israel's response didn't deal with the specifics of the incidents that were asked about in the Foreign Office letter. It said that they're committed to complying with international humanitarian law, that they're capable of complying, and that they've complied to date. But it didn't deal with those specific incidents. I mentioned also that they talked about why sometimes civilian objects are targeted, blaming Hamas for being infiltrated into civilian areas. And so it was inadequate in that respect. It didn't deal with any of the specifics of the request, but the request itself was also quite limited. The Foreign Office letter, it simply dealt with quite a limited number of issues. I mentioned the amnesty report of the 10th of October, the strikes on Al-Shifa Hospital, the strikes on a convoy. It didn't deal with the sheer number of incidents that were described in our application of judicial review, for example. So the government, although it was disturbed by some of the response and found that it didn't in particular explain why the supplies of essential goods are being restricted, and that in particular could indicate a breach of international law, they considered that it was adequate that Israel was acting in accordance with what it believed to be its international obligations.
Thank you, Alice. Any more questions from the floor? If not, then thank you very much for coming. We still have the room for slightly longer, so if any journalists would like a one-to-one, then please come to speak with me afterwards, and I'll see if I can arrange that with some of those people. But thank you again to Heidi, Alice, and Kaya for speaking today, and thank you all for coming and your interest. The last thing I'd like to say again is if you would like to contact ICJP's press team, there are cards at the back next to the water, and we'll be able to respond to you if there's any inquiries throughout the day. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you.